Today's gospel contains perhaps the most cited Christian bumper sticker out there. John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, so that everyone who believes in him may not perish, but may have eternal life. There are those who wear this as a badge. They are on billboards and bumper stickers. There's football players who wear them on their bodies, politicians that reference this in stump speeches. For example, there's Tim Tebow from a couple years ago. The Christian football player who played for Florida became famous for putting John 3:16 on his face during a championship game, as if the win was attributed to God. Do we really think God takes sides in football games? Obviously, with due respect to Jeremy and Alabama, I think not.
Just saying that. Okay.
Do we really think that God takes sides from one group of human beings against another? In Massachusetts, in Harvard Square where I lived, there was one particular man who day after day would carry a placard that on one side had John 3:16, and on the other side was all the condemnations of hate to many different groups. Is this the God that John's gospel proclaims? To answer one cliché of bumper stickers with perhaps another one, you keep using that word, that phrase, that sight. I do not think it means what you think it means. And if you don't get the reference, you have to go back and watch The Princess Bride. The way John 3:16 is bandied about in our culture, I submit to you, has nothing to do with the gospel writer. It is used as a shorthand to a certain kind of Christian belongingness that is so narrowly constructed that it fails to grapple with the text from which it comes. As it claims its own faith in Jesus Christ, it exudes and condemns others. So we need to back up. We need to go back to the text, and we need to grapple with all of its complexity. John's gospel was written as one of the latest gospels of the four, most likely around the turn of the century. Early Christianity and the Judaism of that time had seen Rome destroy the temple in 70 CE, all of 30 years before John wrote the gospel. John is speaking to a community whose lives are ruled by the Roman Empire. It is a community that shares language and customs with Judaism, but also with the Greek and Roman worlds. It is trying to grapple with its place in the world, even as it is marginalized by all around it. The emerging Jewish reform movement, because it had not yet become Christianity, is struggling to figure out where it belongs. And to proclaim that Christian faith in that time meant that you were at peril of your economic means, definitely your social status, and perhaps even your life. For this is the time of the Christian martyrs. And it is important to remind ourselves that we live in a completely different context. None of us in this room, I suspect, will say to someone, I am a Christian, and have to face loss of job or potentially loss of life. There are places in the world where that is not true, but here in the United States, we are not persecuted like that. So this comes from a community of people who are unlike us in that way. And we have to try to understand from within that context what was the good news John was trying to proclaim. The passage today is set we get a snippet of it. It's set in Jesus' coming out and having a conversation with Nicodemus. Nicodemus was one of the religious authorities of his day, possibly part of the Sanhedrin. He came to Jesus in secret. He did not want to risk what it might mean to come in the daylight. And so Jesus has this conversation with Nicodemus. And in our passage, he begins, "Just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whoever believes in him may have eternal life." John is making an analogy to a Hebrew story, one that his communities would be aware of. He is making it back to the story we heard in our first reading out of Numbers. And that setting is of a people who have fled Egypt, who have been delivered out of slavery and into wilderness. They are frustrated. They are hungry. They are thirsty. They do not know how long it's going to be before they are ever settled again. They do not know what the promised land is going to look like. And so this story, as several before it, is of a people grumbling back at God. This story, they come to Moses and they say, "We have no food, we're hungry, we have no water, we're thirsty. What is all this?" And they start grumbling back at God. And this is where the story takes, admittedly, a strange turn, especially to our ears. Because we're told by the mechanisms of the story that God he looks at it and says, "Okay, I hear your whining." And it is as if God is standing there looking down, and you may have heard this in like Bad Parenting Day, when you look down and say, "Excuse me, stop whining, or I'll give you something to really whine about." He did. He sent him snakes. On my Facebook page, this might come under some of my parent friends say things like /tag parent fail. This might be /tag God fail. But that is not the point. It is a mechanism to move the story, yes. It is also a play off of Hebrew words. For the word for poisonous is also the word for fiery. And what we can imagine is that God is listening to all these complaints and getting mad and angry. For what is happening in the midst of the complaints is that the people have forgotten that God is the source of all deliverance and all salvation. God has kept them alive and brought them out of Egypt. And while they're in misery, they have forgotten, and they start to believe that perhaps slavery was more important and easier than to be with God in freedom. So God does not promise that life is always easy. Salvation may not look like what we think it does. And so we have to look. What might that be to John? Moses, in the midst of that, created the bronze serpent for the people to look at. Again, another play off of Hebrew words. Both the word for serpent and bronze are very much alike each other. It also harkens back to a context within Greek thought and Greek mythology of the one who heals. It was a reminder. The snake up on the pole was the way to remind the people that, in fact, God is the one who delivers. God is the one who heals. And ye you in the middle of your misery who forget that in terms of God. That is the point of Numbers. And so John brings that story and he moves it forward into early Christianity. And for his people who also are worried and live in fear and look around and say, "Oh my God, what is this that I proclaim? What does it do to my life?" because freedom in God does not translate at this point in time to major success in society. It does not give material wealth. Instead, it does quite the opposite. It puts you at odds with the society and the way it was constructed and the powers of its time. We are told in John that the English translation is, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, so that everyone who believes in him may not perish, but may have eternal life." The translation of "believe" is also misleading for us who stand here today trying to understand this text. God does not demand a belief. It is not an intellectual assent to God. Rather, perhaps it's more trust. It is that we are trusting our lives to God, that we are willing to live our lives in God, that we are willing to shape our lives in the way that God would want us to live. That is what the term means. It is truly a challenge for us to equate whether life is hard or not, this process to always live in God. We are told, indeed, God did not send the Son into the world to condemn the world, but in order that the world might be saved through him. Those who trust in him are not condemned, but those who do not trust are condemned already, because they have not trusted in the name of the only Son of God. They have not walked in the way of Jesus Christ. The point of the story is that if we do not live in the way of God, we are living in the way of the world. And salvation is not individual. This is not our individual belief and assent. Our way of living in God creates by its very being, by its very act of doing and living, the salvation that we all live. It is what creates this mold where heaven and earth will come together in God's reign and in God's time. That is what John is talking about. That is what John is trying to say to his community and thus to us. That it is about our willingness to step into God. And that may or may not create major havoc in our lives. Some of us, it will turn our lives upside down and over and bring us to places we never ever imagined we would be. I suspect some of you may know what that means. But it demands all of us. And in John's gospel, that is what he is trying to say. That we give our lives over to God. So it is not about material success. It is not about what many out there in certain lands of Christianity try to equate with what it means to be living in God. So if it's not about worldly success, what does it concretely look like? What does this living in God look like? We have one clue in what our presiding bishop would call the Episcopal branch of the Jesus movement. As a body and group, we have come together and we have tried to wrestle as a whole church with what it means to live in God. We give our yes to that in the baptismal covenant. It's on page 304. Sometime this week, I suggest you look at it and that you pray with it. And you might even think about inwardly digesting it. Because it is the principles of the way we, over the years, have come to understand is our way of living in God. It is what our baptismal people who are studying now in classes will say and stand up on Easter Vigil and Sunday morning, and they will give their yes publicly. Many of us have already done that, and we too will renew our yes. So, what is it that God demands? What is it that John is trying to say? Know in your heart that God is the one who delivers all, that God is the one who brings salvation, and it is in God that we will trust. Amen.